Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to call to order our annual meeting of the Lyon County Historical Society. For want of a gavel, I brought a mallet. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. It's so good to see so many of you here this evening. Most of the faces are familiar, and the names are often a blur in my brain, so please excuse me. But I'll come around and ask for names later. It is really good, though, to see so many of you here, although I suspect that, like Paul and I, some of us came more for the pizza than for anything else. But seriously, it is fun, isn't it, to gather with others who love local and regional history. And it's true that we share a love for history, but we also share a commitment to do something with that love, and that's what's really cool, because we're committed to preserving and sharing that history. That, in fact, is our mission, isn't it? So let's remember that ultimately what we do as a local historical society is we remind our regional communities of who we are, from whence we came, and how we came to be as we are today, as well as who we were along the way on that trip to today. So thank you all for that shared commitment, and a special thanks for those of you who donate all those volunteer hours to help us with the mission of the Historical Society. So we're here today to sort of celebrate us in a way, and so the first celebration of us is I want to thank you all for being here, and thank you for loving regional and local history enough to be a part of us. So thank you, everybody. Last year, I was a brand new president, and Jennifer gently taught me that one of my privileges and duties is to introduce our fantastic staff and our board members. So the staff comes first, because as probably all of you already know from working with them, they are the secret sauce that makes the magic happen, that enables the museum to do what the museum does, to bring that magic of local life and local history to our communities. So if you're ever in need of a pick-me-up at any time, well, during the hours of museum operations anyway, you need only walk in the museum and chat a bit with our executive director of the museum, Jennifer Andries, and her right-hand man and our collections manager, Paul Evenson. And they will set you to right. And they will serve up a heap and helping of well-preserved, well-presented regional history. They'll answer any questions you've got or make up answers to your questions. And they'll send you on your way with a smile and maybe some ice cream and feeling better about our world and our communities. So they are our staff, and thank you guys. I enjoy working with both of you. And then we've got our dedicated board members, and I've put them in alphabetical order. So that's I couldn't think of any other way to organize things that made sense to me. So we've got Jerry Bottleberg of Minnesota, who is here. Jennifer said that Jerry might be a little bit late because he had a client meeting going on, but he made it. So we have Jerry from Minnesota, Pam Bush. Pam is, did I get this right, from Island Lake Township? Okay, north of Russell. Jeff Kolnick of Marshall cannot be with us today. Jan Lawaji, however, is also here from... She was, but she had another meeting. She was the president of that organization, so... Yeah, she came, and ran away. But she's from Fairview Township, I think, just south of Green Valley. A treasurer over here, John Sherman, is from Marshall. Our board secretary, Marilee Thomas of Lake Marshall Township. Marilee. Marilee is a special board member because she's the only one of us during board meetings who has to sit there and actually work, because she has to take the notes and prepare the minutes for them. Cassie Weiss is a board member from Marshall. She was unable to join us this evening. Our vice president, however, is here, Carol White of Marshall. Carol. I still feel badly about Carol because a couple of us convinced her to become the vice president, and immediately following her saying, okay, I'll take that short straw, she had to preside over the next board meeting because I was going to be gone. So thank you, Carol. And I'm Bill Palmer, also of Lake Marshall Township. The board is also assisted by Lyon County Commissioner Gary Crowley, who is not with us tonight, and Marshall's City Administrator Sharon Hansen, who is unable to join us tonight. They are not members of the board, but they participate as observers for the county and the city, and we're always glad they're there, and sometimes they have some really good ideas to help us. And we figure we only come out ahead with observers sitting in on our meetings because, by the way, they give us the majority of our funds. So if they see what we're doing and how we're doing it, and they see that we use our money, our funding wisely, then we all come out ahead. At this point, please welcome our treasurer, John Sherman, who's going to share an overview of our financials from operational year 2022.
All right, thank you, Bill. Now I'll try to make this as short as possible because it's the most boring part of the meeting by a long shot. So 2022, we were actually just under 10,000 in our actual balance versus our budgeted to just full year amount. We were a little behind, as you can see, in operations. That's mostly utilities, things like that. It's not surprising, I'm sure, to anybody here. We were a little bit ahead in programs, enterprise, restricted, and investments. And just to note below that, our income from retail, which is the gift shop, the ice cream sales, things like that, while it was fine, it was down from last year, most likely due to less of the images books being sold. Where we stand as of year end was the total of those three accounts is $109,849, and the good news is where we stand as of May month end is $176,942, so about a 61% increase. We are running a little ahead on some programs. We haven't hit some program spending. Some of it's been a little bit less than we thought it was going to be. And we actually had 2 significant donations that we received that are in that total as well. So, good news. Any questions? Thank you.
And Jennifer gets to take over the stage, the mallet, and the big screen.
Okay, so 2022 annual report. There are handouts on your tables. Visitor attendance, people who signed our guest book, was an awesome number, the best number since we've been in the old library. And I think a lot of that had to do with coming out of COVID. A lot of people were looking for things to do in 2022. We also had 2 temporary exhibits that drew in a lot of people. One was our wedding dress collection, which was very popular, and that was from June through the early September. And then with Marshall's 150th anniversary last year, that drew in a lot of people, and we did a temporary display where we brought out a lot of Marshall items in our Heritage Room exhibit. So very popular exhibits. The anniversary helped with attendance, just coming out of COVID too. On the back side is just a listing of programs, events, presentations that we did in 2022, a lot more than 2021 and 2020. Things are starting to get back to normal. One thing that we did last year for the first time was an escape room at the schoolhouse, which was a fundraiser for the schoolhouse. We did that last year. Our Halloween Family Fun event, which we did on the Saturday before Halloween, drew in a lot of people. We know probably like around 600-700 people, kids and their families coming through the museum trick-or-treating, looking for pumpkins. Big event for us as far as attendance-wise goes. We had a successful Christmas tree walk last year, and we had the holiday home tour last year. So that drew in good funds for the museum, and overall a good year, and things were picking up last year, and hopefully that will continue. Okay, so I think the next few slides are me before we get back to Bill to talk again. So something new that we're going to be doing for the annual meeting is to honor those that passed away in the past year. These are either members of the Historical Society, volunteers, those who donated funds or artifacts to the museum, and we lost several last year. So this list goes from the beginning of 2022 up through May 1st of this year. And I'm just going to name off their names here of those that we lost. Sandra Altman, Juanita Schreiber, Kenneth Mucamella, Carolyn Borboom, Jean Barker, Roger Dale, Dolores Rands, John Strandberg, Lawrence Morse, Dwayne Labatt, David Gislason, Dwayne Goodman, Howard Moore, Sharon McCulley, Carol Halverson, Sandy Redding, Donald Moat, Jerry Slatton, Mark Goodnell, Darlene Mackey, Donata DeBrucker, and Evelyn Hively. And then my last part for tonight's meeting is to share a look ahead as far as what we're working on for 2023. First of all, we are going to be opening our new exhibit on Vietnam, which will open August. We are planning to do an exhibit preview on August 8th for all veterans and their families to come and see the exhibit. And that will be open for at least 3 to 4 years. So it's a temporary but semi-permanent exhibit. We are also looking at updating the basement, so we need to focus on updating the basement exhibit. So after we're done with Vietnam, we'll be looking at adding new signage in the basement and changing the displays around because it's been pretty static for a while. And then I have a picture there of our storage room in the basement. We applied for a legacy grant last year to help us with getting some mobile shelving. We were denied last year, but we're looking to apply again this year. So we're going to be doing that. So that is part of what we're going to be working on this year for 2023. All right, so now back to Bill.
Thank you, Jennifer. Now, this next part of the meeting, folks, this is where you earn your pizza and sweet treats, because this is the open discussion section, and we really want to hear from you in this section because we're looking for suggestions, we're looking for feedback about what we've done or what we plan to do, or requests for things you think we ought to be doing in the future. So I broke it out with a couple specific questions, and I'm gonna just lead off with this one. What would you say we have been doing well and that we should continue to do or expand? And Marilee, when these responses come in, and I know they'll be flowing in, can you keep track of them, please? Okay. So what do you think that we do well and that you'd like to see continue or expand? What have you enjoyed, in other words? Yes, ma'am?
Yeah, I like the changes that are always done every month in the general store. Different holidays and just different seasons. It's always interesting.
Thank you. And the credit goes over here to Jennifer for that vision. I like our temporary exhibits. And I know we intend to continue doing temporary exhibits. Any other ideas there? Doc?
My wife loved the wedding dress concept, variety of wedding dresses.
Stories.
The stories.
Right.
Stories.
In the curator world or in the historical world, we call that the provenance of our artifacts. Basically, it's the story behind those photographs, those dresses, those shoes, the hats, and all the rest of it. So thank you for your feedback on that question. Now a slightly different kind of question. What would you suggest we look into doing that we have not yet done or we haven't done in a while? So something new or something that you've seen before that we've not done in a while? Sir?
Well, like a music display. Starting out, our generation started in the 50s, the 60s, and 70s, things of that era. So I know some of us, through time, have collected, we've seen them, the artists,
Uh-huh.
like the Righteous Brothers and Tony Allen and all these guys. And some of us got things that we could donate. Like I personally got a 45 RPM Frankie Avalon, Venus. 59 is the #1 hit. And I was at a casino in Las Vegas, and he saw this, the autograph for me. So I've got it framed up, and I don't know, and some other guys got guitars and autographed by people, and we're in the stage of estate planning. What do we do with these things? It means nothing to our kids. So maybe there's some way you could accept some of these gifts.
I have an idea for those things. One can donate them to the Lyon County Historical Society, or if one is not done using them, one can loan them to us for like a temporary exhibit, perhaps. But that's a great idea, because it can go way back, and it can come up much more to contemporary times as well. I mean, there could be a whole series of temporary exhibits, touching different musical genres, musical eras, etc.
I think the music exhibit should end in 1970.
Cut it off. 75, that's pretty good.
I'd like to see Tina Turner. She just passed.
Yes, she did. Yep.
It was exceptional.
Well, when you think about it, music speaks to us in different ways, because for many of us, we relate to that music when we were teens, That was such a special time in our life, and the music was a soundtrack for that time of our life. And so we may be onto something here.
Does the rap music talk to you?
No, it generally doesn't.
But it talks to somebody.
It does, yes. Okay.
I would say,
Yes, ma'am.
more on the other question, I feel like the museum has become like a destination or kind of a tourist attraction. Over these years, it keeps improving, and so you bring people to it who visit or come to see a specific exhibit.
And thank you for doing that. And that is our hope, is that we become a place where folks want to bring their out-of-town visitors, or we've had a bus tour or two make a stop here. The bus tour was organized in another community, another city, and then we were one of the stops on a regional tour. So
And don't forget the columns, I'm going to say.
that's
I love
pretty cool.
Jennifer's and yours.
Yeah.
That you are in the newspaper, or I'm sure on Facebook too, where you can kind of get that news that we're a lively organization.
And I'm going to come back to that Facebook thing in a minute. Jerry.
As a board, well, I haven't been to two meetings, but with curating a podcast once a month, that'd be a way to get what we're doing here way out there for everyone. Would that be, takes a lot of work, but would that be something we could start exploring?
It's such a logical another step to what we do, because like you say, it's another way to tell stories, to share stories, another way to broaden people's understanding of what's available through the museum, through our collections.
Other mass media is great, it's just another way,
Mm-hmm.
everybody has a different way of connecting with different
Right.
mediums.
Yep, and that's so true, especially today. I mean, so many folks, they explore the world through that device that they have, and hopefully that device, in our case, it'll convince them to come by and see us sometime too. Another good idea. Thank you, Jerry. Are there any missing parts of our history that we need to address?
What parts do we not know that we need to address?
Yes. Well,
Do we talk enough about the other cities and townships, being that we're county?
that's one thing that we are acutely aware of. The second floor does a very good job of that. And I think, Jennifer, as you organize the mercantile exhibit, we have other stores from other communities represented in there. As we've been organizing the Vietnam veterans, or the Vietnam exhibit, we've been drawing in as many veterans from around the larger community as we can. And so you'll see faces, names, stories, experiences from multiple communities around the county. That's one of our goals. We are the Lyon County Historical Society, not the Marshall Historical Society. And at least I remind myself of that all the time. Any other comments, suggestions, or feedback from the group? Thank you, all those who threw out ideas. We really appreciate that because you share our love for what we do. Doc?
As part of the Vietnam exhibit, will you sell or have available your little books, the memoirs of the members of Lyon County that were in the military?
It's a goal of ours.
One of our goals is to compile all the stories that I've been writing about recently about our Vietnam veterans and make them available in book form, illustrated with photos that they've shared with us. So that is one of our hopes, that we can put that together. I will say we do have in the gift shop my 2007 book, which is a collection of stories from when I was interviewing folks in the 2000s. Next, I'm going to ask for an interactive kind of thing by a show of hands. So if you need to say things or want to say things, you're welcome to say things too. But first, I'm going to ask for a show of hands. How many of you have explored our offerings via our website? How many of you have been to our website and looked up information on the website? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, nice. Thank you. How many of you have gone to our Facebook page? Okay, 3. How many of you have accessed information via Twitter about the Lyon County Historical Society? Marilee, well done. How about via Instagram? Anybody? John, well done, sir. Oh, and over here too, so thank you. I wanted to go through this exercise just in part to address one of Jerry's suggestions, is that we're trying to expand the different ways we give people access to the stories, the artifacts, the information we have in our collections. And we'll continue to do that. And in fact, I went online just today and I realized Jennifer started, how long has that blog been in there, Jennifer, on our website?
4 years.
Oops, okay. So it's not brand new, but it was new to me. I discovered that today. So thank you for helping us with some feedback. We very much appreciate that. And now you know that we're out there. We have a website. You can access us via Facebook page, and we're also on Twitter and Instagram. So I know, I have never done a tweet in my life. I don't even fully understand what Instagram is, but there are many who do, and that's the way they access information.
Jennifer does a wonderful job on Facebook. Anybody get on that, they see a lot. She does a wonderful job.
Very cool. Thank you for that endorsement. Okay, so,
Collection is online also.
I'm sorry?
Our collection is mostly online also.
Yes. Paul, could you explain how folks can access our collection online?
You
Or-
have the page, it's MLHM.
mncollections.org. Yes, so we have, like, how much on there? Like,
12,000 right
yeah, I don't think they're all online though.
now. I think that's about the closest where we are online.
Online. Yeah, so when Paul catalogs donations, he can make them accessible so people can see what we have in our collection. And if you visit the public website, which is the mncollections.org, it has a list of organizations from across Minnesota that are using that service. And if you click on Lyon County Historical Society, then you can see what items that Paul has shared online. So there's a photograph of it and what it is. It doesn't tell people like who the donor was or any of that private information, just what it is and the photograph of the item.
And a map if we know where it is.
And a map if we know where the item originated.
Thank you, Jennifer. So, as you can see, in multiple ways, we're trying to expand the ways folks can access the stories that we are curating at the museum and accessing the artifacts. We have tons and tons of photographs in there. Those are an awful lot of fun to me as a photographer. At this point in the evening, then, I'm going to entertain a motion to adjourn. We have a motion. Do I hear a second? The motion has been moved and seconded that we adjourn the meeting. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Any opposed? The motion carries. We are adjourned. Am I done now?
Yes, you're done for right now. So we'll take about a 5-minute break. That way we can get ready for Bill's program tonight. And then we'll kind of put the food away a little bit. We'll leave the desserts out though, but we'll put the other food away. So we'll take about a 5-minute break if you need to get up and stretch or use the restrooms, and then we'll get started with Bill's program. Okay, so we are going to get started with the last portion of tonight's annual meeting, our program. Bill Palmer, who has been the Historical Society president for the past year, has been on the board for about 3 years. Will be giving tonight's program. I believe the last time that Bill has done a program for the Historical Society was quite a few years ago when he did one on Camden State Park. We had that in our conference room on the 2nd floor. It's been a privilege to work with Bill. He's been doing a lot of work on the Vietnam exhibit as far as interviewing veterans, getting their oral histories. So without further ado, thank you, Bill. I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I want to address a comment that I heard a couple times. People saying, well, they're underdressed for tonight. No, I'm definitely overdressed for tonight, but there's a good reason for that, or at least my reason for it is, if I come equipped like this, I feel more competent. I feel like I know what I'm doing. Now, I'll leave it up to you to judge if that is true in fact or not. But tonight we're going to be talking about doing oral history. The magic, the necessity, the value of doing oral history, sort of, pulling the curtain aside so you can see how it's done. What is it that the wizard does behind that curtain? Before we get going, I just want you to know, please, I'm inviting your questions. As we go through this, interruption is good, because if things come to your mind when we're on a certain thing, just hit me with that question or that comment, because I want to answer your questions and I want to make this interesting. So please don't be shy about asking questions or offering comments. And by the way, watch for faces that you might know. These are all folks who shared images when I did an oral history interview with them. On the far left, the tall, good-looking guy in the middle is Orny Allness. Some of you might know Orny. And that's his two sisters. He's home on leave from the Navy during World War II. The middle image is from Marion Schroeder Pagel. She's one of the kids there at her District 9, maybe, schoolhouse. And then the dapper young gentleman on the far right is Joe DeJager, in case any of you know Joe. So I've been there, I've been doing that, and my point tonight is you can too. This is an invitation to consider doing oral history. And I was eating our meal tonight with some ladies who came specifically to learn about doing oral history. So I'm hoping that I can help answer your questions. We are surrounded by people who have stories, neighbors, friends, relatives, stories like this. You know, the United States of America, we're an immigrant nation, right? We all came from someplace else at some point. If you scratch our family history far enough, you're going to see that our point of origin is not Lyon County, Minnesota. It's not even the United States. We came from Belgium. We came from Norway. We came from Laos. We came from Germany. Palmer is a German name. We came from Mexico. And here's some examples. This is some of Tracy's Corman family when they were still living in Belgium before immigrating, following their dad or her husband to the Tracy area in the early 1900s. Switch forward a few decades, and this is the Mua family in a Thai refugee camp in 1982. We have people with stories like attending one-room country schools and or country churches. You've already seen that picture. I did. I got the District 9 right. But that was Lind Township, and I believe that is Miss Marion. Another township school, Dorothy Swedzinski is in this photo, and I forget which one is she, but that's just over the county line in Redwood County. She went to Milroy High School, but attended a country school through the 8th grade. People with stories. People who ministered to or helped with worship communities, like St. Clotilde Catholic Church in Green Valley. A newer building, at least by my timeline, but a building with history, and it has some very significant recent history that you might know about. Over here, Grace First Parish in Russell. Again, a building with significant history, in fact, recent changes to that parish group. And then this, a lot older, and honestly, I forget where St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church is. I didn't put it up there for that so much as for this character. That is Lori Fetzig's great-grandfather. I don't know what he's doing up on that steeple or how he got there, but we have people whose lives were involved in worship communities like this. We have many people, friends, relatives, neighbors, who served in the military or who served in the Peace Corps overseas. Some examples. One of our board members' sisters, Sharon McCulley from Russell. Bill Furran, who grew up in Marshall. And Dave Zimke, who grew up in Tracy. I added these three military personnel because I interviewed all of them, and all three of them are gone now. If we hadn't done that oral history interview, I don't know how much of their story would be available to us anymore. People have all kinds of stories. People we know, neighbors, friends, relatives, they taught in or attended schools in our area. Anybody recognize this school building? Okay, you gotta say it. You can't just nod. Yeah, that's the old Marshall High School, the North 4th Street building. It looks like in the 1940s, judging by the cars. And this one, none of us would get, but it's a fun one. That's the Amoret Public School student body, 1934, grades 1 through 8. And how about that school? Anybody recognize that building? Very good. Yeah, that's the 1919 original public school building of Russell. It was still part of the RTR middle school until very recently. And then there's this. We know people who attended matinee movies at theaters in Ballatin, Cottonwood, Marshall, Minneota, and Tracy. Does anybody remember the Roxy Theater? Okay, maybe enough said. But that's one of the theaters that used to be in Marshall. How about this one? Anybody recognize this? It's kind of a bad photo, I know.
Tracy?
It is not Tracy. That is the Gem Theater, downtown Ballatin, Minnesota. This one you'll probably recognize. I think that's the coolest theater marquee in Lyon County, and that was the Hollywood Theater in Tracy. So we're surrounded by these people with stories, where they danced, where they met, where they had their wedding receptions. When they grew up at a time very foreign to us in some cases. Might have been the dirty 30s. They might have started farming with horses or mules and transitioned to tractors. Or they may have transitioned from those early tractors to the more advanced equipment, the diesel engines that came on board later on. Or maybe they lived through crises, like this gentleman. A little bit difficult to see him, but that's Roger Dale being interviewed, an oral history interview about the flood of 1957. But we've had our disasters in the county, and those are stories that are worth finding and preserving. Maybe they worked at places that don't exist anymore, or maybe they were on the ground floor of places that became really big, like Schwann's. How about those who drank milk from the chiller tank out in the milk shed? Or from that glass milk bottle that was delivered every Tuesday morning to 225 North Hill Street, Marshall, Minnesota, by Terrace Park Dairy. Or maybe some of you or some of your friends or your parents, relatives, have this experience, hosting a hobo for lunch while he sharpened the kitchen knives for you, give him a sandwich, a piece of pie.
Mr. Plummer, I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
What was the I don't know if to call it an agency or what, when the 57 flood, it was more of a, I don't know if it was local or a state thing, but it was like, I just read it and was going to remember it. It was like a 3-letter acronym for the group that was directing the flood, the thing.
The flood response? I don't know. Jennifer? Okay.
I'll go home and find it on my notepad. But
Okay, thank you.
I'm trying.
Call us at the museum and let us know. I spent some time looking at my notes. I have even more information here. That's why I'm looking down. But and there are other stories too. Some can be unique stories, but they're all interesting stories. What about this? Members of the last graduating class of Ballatin High School, Central Catholic High School, Cottonwood High School, Lynn High School, Russell High School. What was it like to attend these small local high schools? What was that class like? Was it a poignant experience knowing that you're going to be the last graduates from these schools? And then on the other end, what about those early classes at what was then SMSC, Southwest Minnesota State College? You know, a brand new thing in our area. And then in a more contemporary setting, we have military veterans from the global war on terror, the folks who served in Iraq and Afghanistan and Kuwait. They too have experiences. How did they find themselves in uniform? What was it like serving in Iraq? What was it like coming home from that war? And my question after this slide and all these examples of people with stories is, well, what's happening with these and more recent stories? Who is preserving them? Who is asking the questions? Who writes letters today? Who prints out photographs? You know, if you ask Paul and Jennifer and I, we love our photo collections, and letters are insights into people's lives, as are diaries and journals. But I kind of have this feeling, don't you, that in our digital age, fewer and fewer people are writing letters, fewer and fewer people are keeping journals or diaries. And this is not necessarily a bad thing, except are they archiving their digital images? Are they archiving their text messaging or their emails? And I think the answer is probably not. So how are we going to assemble those stories? I won't leave you with a dilemma without an answer, and you already know what the answer is. Well, oral history is the way we share those stories. This lady up there is Dorothy Swidzinski. She was the one who shared that photo of her mother and her family in Belgium. What I haven't told you yet is that the Belgium that they were in was at that time occupied by the German army in World War I. Their father had come across the ocean to the United States to establish himself, to get himself a job, to get a home for the family and stuff, and then I'll send for you when I'm already set up. Well, he got here in 1911. He didn't get them out before 1914, and that's when the Germans invaded Belgium. And so his wife and his kids had to endure German occupation for years. Even if they wanted to leave, the Germans wouldn't let them leave. So her mom and her family experienced deprivation, great deprivation, food shortages, violence. When the Allies came back through and reinvaded Belgium, you know, there was shelling going on and bullets flying and stuff. Her mom wrote this down and then gave it to Dorothy, and Dorothy shared it with me. And of course, Dorothy had her own stories too. Yes, ma'am.
Well, talking about that in Belgium, they would, because the Germans were there, people dropped real live cats from the upstairs windows on the soldiers. And grandma, Jerry's grandma, would talk that way, and even to this day, they have a celebration of, they don't throw live cats now. But they have stuffed cats that they still throw out the window. That's part of their celebration.
Oh, for
But
Pete's sakes.
imagine having a cat coming down on you.
Right.
Claws, you know.
That happened in Antwerp. She told me a lot of stories how she was on trains, didn't know she's going to live or not. Shipped all over because of the occupation.
Well, to take a very gruesome scenario and make it into a bad joke, that would have been a cat surgency, I guess. I apologize.
But they tried throwing cats out, feral cats out in girls that got scratched, and then they got cat disease from scratching. They got rid of it a few trees.
Oh, for Pete's sakes. And see, that's the glory of oral history, to preserve stories like that. Anybody know Sander? Lives and farms just south of Amaret. Sander shared stories about what it was like to attend that Amaret public school. He shared that photo with me. 1934, that wasn't his class, by the way, but that was his dad's class. His dad was in that picture. So he told me stories about attending Amaret public school. He particularly remembered they would have a Halloween procession each year. The kids would dress up, they'd walk through town, they'd end up at the general store, and they'd get treats from the folks who own the general store in Amoret, Minnesota. He told me stories about that Chicago Northwestern trestle. You remember that one? That was a scary thing to me as a little kid. It was so high, and there are no rails on it. I remember that. But he talked about what it was like to walk across that trestle, he and his friends. And he told about some daredevil friends who actually drove cars across that thing. Now, I don't think that would meet with the approval of the Chicago Northwestern Railroad Company, but and then there's this guy. Some of you might know him. He went to the Roxy Theater, and he talked about, yep, Mom would give us a dime, 9 cents for admission to the movie, and then we get a penny candy along with it. That was part of his growing up. But then there were other stories. Some stories Mom knew about, like going to the Roxy for 10 cents. Other stories I don't think Mom ever knew about, like he and his friends who would play a game they called the boxcar game. They would jump on a moving train as it was getting underway, and then see how long, who would jump off first as the train was picking up speed. He also talked about when he joined the Navy, he had to get his dad's permission because he was 17 yet. And he went to his dad's workplace. His dad worked at one of the elevators. And all the World War II vets came because he heard that Lyle was coming to get permission to join the Navy. All the World War II vets who worked with his dad came, and they shook his hand and they said, "You're doing the right thing. It's going to be a good experience for you." And Lyle kind of choked up talking about that. That was quite the experience for him. He also talked about he was a catapult operator on an aircraft carrier. That was his job, launching jet aircraft off, I think it was the USS Constellation. And he talked about doing that during the Gulf of Tonkin incident that expanded the U.S. involvement in the war in Vietnam. They didn't even know that they were launching aircraft into a war zone. They got combat pay retroactively 3 months later, and that's when they heard that, yeah, their aircraft had been bombing North Vietnam. Oral history tells these stories. There's Marion. You already saw her picture at the District 9 County School in Lynn Township. She talked about how her teacher would organize the lessons for all the kids, grades 1 through 8, and they'd start with the youngest grade first and then work up to the oldest kids. And so all the kids heard one another's lessons over time. And of course she talked about the games they played during recess, and she talked about the boys who would get in trouble. She didn't name names though, so she was still an honorable lady in that way. But she also talked about a tragedy in their family where their family home burned down. They lived west of Marshall on Highway 19, right on Highway 19. Their family home burned down. And that home, by the way, used to be a stagecoach stop. So it had a really cool history itself. It burned down, and the family had to live in the county poor farm for a couple of months until they could get a new garage built. And then the family moved into the upstairs of the garage until they could get their new home built. So that was quite an experience for a young girl growing up in the 30s and 40s. Here's someone who's really familiar to one of our board members, Sharon McCulley. When I interviewed Sharon, it was because she was an Air Force veteran, and she explained what it was like to manage aero evacuations of seriously injured GIs from Vietnam to get them to a higher level of medical care that they required. She also described how the different types of aircraft were configured. The C-130 could take the most casualties, the C-123 took fewer casualties but could get into smaller airstrips, and the C-7 took the fewest casualties. And so they had different levels of staff depending on how many casualties they would be carrying. And they always knew in advance who they were picking up, what kind of injuries they had, where they were going. She also talked about the language barriers that they faced when they were managing Vietnamese patients. So you imagine a Vietnamese child who had been injured, a Vietnamese woman who may be pregnant in childbirth, or a Vietnamese soldier who had been injured, trying to assess what they needed, where they were hurting, what it felt like, and stuff like that. She wrote a little book, and Pam, you've probably heard about that story. She wrote a book where she translated basic medical questions into Vietnamese and into, I think it was 4 other languages, wasn't it, Pam? I know it was more than just Vietnamese, because they would carry Laotian patients sometimes, and Montagnards sometimes from the highlands. At my table, we were talking about this gentleman a little bit, Harold Mellentine. He always has a lot to say, by the way, and he's a great guy. But I interviewed him in a pretty focused way about his experience as a kid during the dirty 30s, what it was like growing up during those terrible years when crops wouldn't even come in some cases. He talked about dust storms that piled dirt along the fence rows. And decades later, there would still be mounds of dirt where the fence rows used to be. He talked about farmers desperately trying to buy old straw piles from his father because there was nothing else to feed their livestock. He talked about a springtime experience where every spring, the year-long leases had expired on farm places, and the roads were just full of farm families who had to leave their lease because they could not make the next payment, and they were looking to move to another farm place. So it's these folks who can bring life to history by sharing their experiences. What's our role? If you become an oral historian, what is your role? What do you do? Well, Dorothy and Harold are going to supervise me as I go through this. Well, we are facilitators. They are the storytellers, not us. The stories belong to them. They decide whether and how much to share. And this is the part that really hits home with me. When you think about what they're doing, they're entrusting us with a part of their life that's important to them. This obliges us with a responsibility, doesn't it? We need to treat their stories with dignity. Occasionally, an interviewee will tell me something and then say that's off the record. And so that's in the interview, but I never include it in anything that I publish. We facilitate their storytelling by preparing for each interview, so our questions, I got to keep you up with me here, so our questions help them to share their experiences. We also facilitate their storytelling by listening carefully to what they're telling us. And we can adjust our interview based on what they're sharing. And sometimes they'll be sharing stuff with us that, like, my path was going here and they're going this way. Well, guess which way we go? We go this way, because that's what they're comfortable talking about. That's what they want to share at that moment. So we have to follow the path of the interviewee. We facilitate their sharing their story by creating a record of the interview. And I'll show you how we do that in a minute. The digital record, which is what I do, is just the beginning, though. At some point, generally, you have to transcribe that story. We also facilitate the storytelling even more widely by publishing it in some way. Many of you have read my columns. That's a way of publishing these folks' stories. But it's not the only way. I understand that somebody may be working on a local church's history coming up. If you publish a book, that's another way of sharing those stories. We can only publish, though, by doing this, by obtaining a release from the interviewee. And we'll go through that in a little bit more detail, but that's what enables you to put it in the newspaper, to put it in a publication of some kind. So this oral history making that we're doing, who do we do it for? Well, some of us like to do oral history so we can share it with our families. And I want to introduce you to, that's Joan Phyllis Lamberton, now Palmer. That's my mom in her graduation picture from Redwood Falls High School, 1951. So I've been working with Mom for years, collecting her stories, and sharing some of them already with our larger family, recording her stories, interviewing her, also using other tools like questionnaires and what I call story forms. So for whom else do we do this? Sometimes we just may enjoy doing oral history. And I grabbed that old picture of me. You can tell it's an old picture because I still have color in my beard there. But sometimes you may want to do it for another organization. Like a lot of my oral history I'm sharing with the Lyon County Historical Society. So, the actual doing part. What do we do? Well, one of the first steps is to identify who am I going to interview? Well, that's totally dependent on your purpose, isn't it? If you're working with family, then you're going to interview family members, or perhaps people with special knowledge of your family, like longtime neighbors or co-workers. If it's your own project, well, then you have to ask yourself, who can help me with information about this project? If you want to work with us, you may have your own areas of interest of Lyon County history. Like maybe you're interested in farming. Maybe you have a particular interest in some form of immigration history in Lyon County. Maybe, like one of my favorite periods is the Depression era. Not that it's depressing or anything, I just find that it's an interesting time because there's such an extreme time. Maybe you have favorite places. Camden State Park, another community facility of some kind, a movie theater. And also, if you're interested in working with us, we can help you identify areas where we would like to expand our archives, our archive materials. So that's about identifying whom I work with. And then this is, when you think about it, this is kind of the tricky part, isn't it? How do you approach someone that you'd like to interview? How do you set this up? Well, I would encourage you to think about what would you want to know if somebody comes to you and says, can I interview you, John Sherman, about being a treasurer for the Historical Society? Well, you're going to be wondering right away, why? Why do you want to talk with me? So why are you interested in the story or stories that I might have? What would you like to discuss with me? Answer these kinds of questions for the folks. What do you intend to do with the information I share with you? That's kind of important to most of us. If you're working with us, the Lyon County Historical Society, that often helps. Then they say, oh, okay, you're doing this to foster the mission of the Historical Society. That can help. And then you always want to explain to them, this is really their business. It's not your business. It's their story, not your story. They get to choose whether they want to share, and if so, how much they want to share. So make sure they understand that up front. That gives them agency over their own story. Ask them if they have any questions. And then the second part is important. Answer their questions. And if you don't know, tell them you don't know, but you'll figure it out. that first contact, I always ask some background information, like, where did you grow up? Did you grow up on a farm or were you a townie? See, that helps me figure out some of the questions that I'll want to follow up on during the interview. Did you have siblings? What did your parents do? Where did you live? Those kinds of things. Because if you live in Russell, that's going to set up different kind of questions in my head than if you live in Cottonwood. And then, this is pretty important stuff here. Figure out where you want to conduct the interview with them. And it should be a place that's quiet, comfortable, and free of distractions. These are some possibilities. Usually I go for a neutral site. And working for the Historical Society, that becomes easy because I can work with Jennifer and figure out a space at the museum where I can do some oral history interviewing. I've done it at the library here as well. Sometimes I've gone to their home. Mrs. Dale, where are you at? Okay, yeah. I interviewed Roger and her at their home. Sometimes I've done it at my home, but it really depends on their level of comfort with where you do that, and you want them to be comfortable. So now we've got someone willing to talk with us, and so we need to figure out our questions. And there are two big categories of questions. I call these data questions, and it's like identifying information. It's names, it's places, it's dates. That's an example. Here's another example. List your siblings by their names and in their birth order. For veterans, what was your unit of assignment in Vietnam? When did you serve? Where was it located? So those are, the data questions are pretty straightforward. It's specific information, but the fun ones are these, open-ended questions. Describe your barn's main floor and the loft and the purposes that they served, how you used them. Explain how your teacher organized the day's lessons for that grade 1 through 8 in that one-room schoolhouse. And this is one that I asked Sharon McCulley. Describe how you received notice of an air evacuation flight and how you would prepare for that mission. How much time did you have? Did you have to notify anybody else who would be on your team for that evacuation flight? And this is always a fun one for farm kids. How did your chores evolve as you grow older? And they tend to moan, and they got bigger, they got longer. I had to do more stuff. Except they generally smiled about, I got to start operating the tractor. I graduated from the old tractor to the big tractor and stuff like that. So those are the questions. That's the question prep part. And then you assemble your tools. This is my favorite. It's a simple digital voice recorder. Mine was in the $30 to $40 range. They're probably less expensive now. It's a simple tool. It's got a microphone up there. You can clip that to the interviewee so their voice comes through real loud and clear. And then it has a built-in mic so you can hear my voice as well. But that's just one tool. A lot of folks have a notebook computer of some kind. You can use that to do an oral history interview. And by the way, who doesn't have one of these in their pocket anymore? You can even use this for an oral history interview. Each has advantages and disadvantages. You can upload all these devices onto your home computer to archive the interview, to organize the data files. They can all do the job. One major difference is, do you want a video file? That's a significant consideration. Only 2 of them will give you a video file. Here's another one. The notebook, it stands by itself. The cell phone, you got to be holding the darn thing. Or get a stand for it. So those are some more of your tools.
You ever do virtual one, or is it always in person?
That's a good question. I've interviewed some distant veterans, like, oh golly. You guys probably remember his name better than I do. Who was the pilot that I recently wrote about? Grew up in Tracy, shot down over Laos. Anyway, he lives in California. And so what I did with him, he wanted to go and interview, and so I came up with a series of questionnaires. I would send him the questionnaires electronically in advance so he could see the questions, and then I'd arrange a time to call him. And we did 4 or 5 separate questionnaires on 4 or 5 different occasions. It took me easily 3 times as much time to do that as it did a regular oral history interview. Thank you. Thank you for that question. So those interview questions, it's a mix of those 2 types of questions, but those open-ended questions, those are the moneymakers. Those are the interesting ones. So you're going to have far more open-ended questions than data-type questions. You prepare them in advance, print them out, bring them with you, and show them to your interviewee. You don't want them wondering, what the heck is on that piece of paper? He's reading that long piece of paper, what's going on? You want to build trust with your interviewee, so show them what you're doing at every stage. There are no secrets in the interview. You don't want them thinking that I'm doing something other than what we had already talked about. And of course, during the interview, your questions are just a starting point. So be prepared to follow detours as they come up, and be prepared to gently redirect them if you need to, because you don't have the time to follow all the detours. That might be a follow-on interview. Here's what one type of release form looks like. We use this with our Vietnam Veterans Questionnaire. What does a release form do? It does these 4 things. The interviewee is consenting to the interview with you, and they're assigning their copyright interest to you. Now, this is where I get to put on my attorney hat, which I hardly ever wear anymore, but the judge knows what I'm talking about. Whenever you create a document, a photograph, a poem, a piece of music, it's automatically protected by U.S. copyright law. And what that means is, you're the only one who can publish it, unless you give someone else the right to publish it. So the second paragraph here is granting, it's an assignment of that copyright interest, in this case to the Historical Society. So when you do an interview with somebody, you've just created a copyrighted thing, copyrighted bit of intellectual property. And so this assignment of copyright interest enables me or the Historical Society to use that information without having to go back to you again for a further approval. It also gives us the authority to use their name and their image if you take a picture of them. And then it releases any legal claims they may have for you using information that they shared with you during the interview. Now some questions ought to be coming up to your mind about working with this. First of all, is this release form necessary? Well, this is how historians have to work. If you don't get a release form, you cannot publish the information they share with you, or the documents they share, or the photographs they share with you. You will need to release it if you intend to publish it in any way. Now, if you're working with my mom, or if I'm working with my mom and I'm only going to share it with the family, I'm not going to get a release from her. But anything beyond that, you need this release. And then this is an obvious question, at least for me. Is it awkward going through this form with your interviewees? Yes. Yes, it is. But you get used to it. And a along the way, from your initial contact, every step of the way, everything should be above board. You want to be building trust in them. You want them to understand what you're doing, why you're doing it, so that when you get to something like this, which is awkward, if you sign this, you're agreeing not to sue me for defamation or invasion of privacy. Well, that's an awkward statement to say. But if they know you by now, if they've seen your work in particular, then there's some level of trust there. And they go, I understand what you're doing, and I understand why you're asking for this. Okay, that's all the hard work. Let's talk about the magic. There's Sharon again, as she appeared when I interviewed her in 2019, and as she appeared in Captain Sharon McCulley in her quarters in Vietnam, 1970. And by the way, I had to put this up there. That is her aeromedical evacuation badge. The wings represent, it's a flight mission, and if you look closely, there's a caduceus in there, a snake wrapped around, the doc knows what I'm talking about, a caduceus. So, the things to remember, we are just a facilitator. They own the story. That the same is true as if they share with documents with you or photographs with you. Your venue, we've already talked about this. Offer breaks. Think about sitting down with someone for 2 hours. It's going to get uncomfortable at some point. So offer breaks. Take breaks. We all need to stretch. We all need to get a drink of water or use the bathroom. One can only sit and talk for so long. And by the way, if it gets longer than you expect, maybe it's time to just say, let's stop for today and reschedule and come back another day. This is an interview. It shouldn't be like grilling a suspect. They should be having fun in the interview. You should be having fun in the interview. I mean, you're focused. You've got a mission. But think of it more as a conversation, a guided conversation. You're guiding the conversation, but they're an equal partner in that conversation. It should be fun. Laughing should be expected. Snorting, sometimes tears. It depends on where the interview is going. But these are all natural things and to be expected. Don't be surprised by them. And they're okay. And we've talked about this a little bit. The interview path may divert from what you were expecting, and that's okay. If you have the interest to pursue that diversion, go ahead, especially if you have the time. Be prepared to gently redirect them back to a more salient topic if you really want to focus on that topic. And always, always, always thank them for their help. Okay, we're in the home stretch here. So far I've talked about oral history interviewing, and that's all it's been. This is an alternative to oral history interviewing, a questionnaire. We use a questionnaire like this with some of our Vietnam veterans. That's all it is, a series of questions for your interviewee. What are the advantages of using a questionnaire? Well, you don't have to be there with them. You can complete it with them over the phone, if that's helpful. And that gets back to the point that John asked me. I did a series of these questionnaires with Neil, there we go, Neil Ostrand in California. You can provide the questionnaire to the interviewee in advance, so they can review the topics. They can address the questions anytime they want. Or they can take as much time as they want. What are the disadvantages of using this tool? Well, you're not there, so it's less personal. And here's the biggest disadvantage. Most of us don't like to write. It's easier for us to talk. Think about it. When we're having a conversation, we're finding out those words left and right. We're talking about this, we're talking about that. Things are happening quickly. If you have to write that down, look at how much that slows you down. And if you don't have confidence in your vocabulary or your spelling or your handwriting, those are just additional burdens that get in the way of sharing that information. So you get less information. The first time I sent a questionnaire like this to a Vietnam veteran, they came back to me with 1- and 2-word answers or maybe a short sentence. And I'm going, oh, I know there's more to the story here. The thing is, they'd be happy to talk about it. They weren't comfortable writing about it. So, if you do a questionnaire over the phone, then the burden falls on you to take notes and take accurate notes. So that slows down the process. Your interviewee, the questionnaire guy, is waiting for you to finish your notes from the last answer. So that can be awkward. And a questionnaire can limit your interviewee because he or she is responding to your questions. Well, they might have stuff that's even cooler, but they're not in your questions. So what's the answer to that? Well, have sort of global questions at the end. Is there anything else that's really important to your membership or your participation in First Lutheran Church that we've not touched on in this questionnaire? You know, a big open-ended question like that, it opens the door to stuff that you didn't get to otherwise. So that's an option. And here's another option I use with my mom. Do any of you know my mom, Joan Palmer? Okay. Do you correspond with her? Do you get cards and letters from Mom? Okay. She is a great correspondent. This is a woman who is not afraid to write. And so this fits right in her wheelhouse. I call them story forms. And if you can squint and see it, it says, winter is growing up in Redwood Falls. And it's a series of questions to Mom about what it was like to grow up in Redwood Falls as a girl in the winter. What did you do? So it's a series of questions on a focused topic. So this was winters. I did summers. I did school. The advantages of this are kind of like a questionnaire. You don't have to be present. Your research subject can see the questions, and in this case, Mom can write about it whenever she's ready to. What are the disadvantages? Again, you're not present, so you can't help them. Oh, let's continue down that road a little bit further. It sounds like you have more to say. It may limit your subject, again, unless you add those global questions. You know, Mom, is there anything else that was important to you about winter in Redwood Falls that we haven't talked about yet? And she talked about the downtown decorations when I had that question in there. And again, many people just don't like to write. And if they don't like to write, you're not going to get much information. I don't have to worry about that with my mom. She writes. So the good news is, this is the last slide. There they are again, our old friends from earlier on. You've asked some questions along the way, but this is your last chance to take your shots at me. Do you have any other questions or comments about the presentation? Yes, ma'am.
Talking about writing,
Uh-huh.
you know, a lot of older people, like my aunts, wrote letters, maybe at Christmas time, saying what they did.
Sure.
You know, they lived on a farm, they had chickens, they butchered them, you know, we're having dinner today, we're having chicken, you know, we sold eggs. They just put that all in their writing, so you knew what they were up to,
Mhm.
you know, back in the days. So my idea is that when you have somebody in your family that passes, you know, it might be your mom or your aunt or whatever, don't just neglect all these writings, because you might have a treasure that is, you know, beyond like you asking me a question. You know, I'm not there now, you know, but when they're writing it themselves, you know, they're saying just, you know, what's happening. You know,
Absolutely.
my garden is like full of weeds because I haven't been out there, or whatever it is, you know.
Yep, absolutely. And that's, you know, Jennifer and Paul and I, that's a treasure trove for historians, is finding those letters and stuff. In my family, my sister Debbie got a hold of the letters from our Grandma Palmer to our Grandpa Palmer before they were married when he was overseas during World War I. So they'd correspond, they'd write back and forth. And Debbie got all those letters and she transcribed them all. And then she would send them out like once a week in an email blast to all of us siblings and to Mom. And she called it Alma's Mailbox. Alma was my grandma's name. And it was just this amazing experience of, we were the fly on the wall now, watching Grandpa and Grandma Palmer correspond with one another before they were married. He was in France. She was back at home. And my sister Debbie's comment was, she kept him on a pretty tight leash. But that's a great point. And that's something that I worry about, is that fewer and fewer people write letters. And so where will we get that correspondence from? Anyone else have questions? Thank you so much. Oh, yes, ma'am.
The words I was trying to think of was civil defense.
Oh, sure.
That's what Roger was doing in the flood of '57. He was working for the civil defense. He got in the National Guard a few months later, but it was the civil defense that worked at that flood in '57 in Marshall.
Sure. Which brings up another topic. How many of you remember the bomb shelters from the 50s and the 60s with that civil defense triangle symbol? There was one in the Marshall's telephone office. I remember that because that's where Dad worked.
That museum is one.
Ah, yes. So, well, thank you so much for your attention, for your questions, and I think this worked mostly. I felt like I was competent. So I appreciate your time and attention this evening. Thank you, everybody.